When Caleb opened his eyes, he was 50 years in the past. In his last life, he had died in a hospital bed, learning only in his final moments that his wife, Victoria, and the man she'd always loved, Julian, had been entangled for 5 decades. Her business trips, 20 days out of every month, had been vacations with him. The entire family knew. He was the only one kept in the dark. And the reason she never married Julian? She couldn't bear to see him shackled by domestic life. She wanted him to shine in his field, while Caleb was only fit to be a stay-at-home dad, steeped in the daily grind of chores and errands. On the day Caleb died, everyone said he was small-minded, that he deserved to die of a broken heart. The first thing Caleb did after being reborn was race to the airport. The terminal was a surging tide of people. Caleb, gasping for breath, pushed through the crowd until he finally saw them. 3 familiar figures at the boarding gate. Victoria stood out in a chic designer suit, her cool elegance a stark contrast to the chaos around her. 5-year-old Chloe, in a little white dress, looked like a miniature version of her mother. And Julian, in a perfectly tailored suit, stood beside them, the 3 of them looking for all the world like a perfect family. Victoria. Caleb's voice echoed through the terminal. All 3 turned at once. Caleb. Victoria's brow furrowed. What are you doing here? Caleb's gaze landed on Julian. Who is he? And where are you going? Julian stepped forward quickly, offering an explanation. Mr. Thompson, you're misunderstanding. Victoria and I are just friends. We're all taking a family trip together. Her parents are here, too. Victoria's frown deepened. She pulled Julian behind her, her eyes cold as she stared at Caleb. How did you find out? Did you come all this way just to make a scene? His 5-year-old daughter, Chloe, shoved him away. Daddy, don't ruin our family vacation. You don't understand anything. You belong at home. A chill washed over Caleb. If it's a family trip, then why don't I belong? I'm your father. I'm your mother's husband. If I don't belong, why does he? Onlookers began to stare. Julian looked mortified. Victoria and Chloe, seeing his discomfort, immediately rounded on Caleb, their sympathy for Julian turning into fury at him. Making a scene in public like this. Have you no shame? Victoria hissed. This is why we didn't want to bring you. You're an embarrassment. Chloe added, looking at Caleb with disgust. Uncle Julian is handsomer than you, more talented than you. He's better than you in every way. I feel sorry for you, having a dad like you. Every word was a knife twisting in Caleb's heart. In his previous life, within the sprawling dynasty of Victoria's family, Caleb had been a tireless spinning top. He was up before dawn to press Victoria's dresses, and up late into the night checking Chloe's homework. If Victoria's parents so much as sneezed, he was at their bedside with tea and medicine. For 50 years, he'd worn himself down for this family, his hair turning gray with worry. But in the end, to all of them, he was nothing more than a male nanny, a convenience whose very existence was superfluous. Seeing the situation spiral, Julian quickly bought another ticket on his phone. Mr. Thompson, why don't you come with us? I'm sorry, we were wrong to overlook your feelings. His apology only made Caleb look more unreasonable in Victoria and Chloe's eyes. On the plane, Victoria and Chloe orbited Julian, doting on him so completely that even the flight attendant mistook them for a family. Caleb sat in a row behind them, staring out the window at the clouds, remembering what Victoria had said to him on his deathbed. I couldn't bear to see him trapped in a kitchen. I needed him to shine. How laughable. Caleb had cooked and cleaned himself into the family joke, while Julian got to spend a lifetime doing what he loved. When they arrived at their destination, a luxury resort in the Catskills, Victoria's parents saw Caleb, and their faces fell. What are you doing here? For 3 days, Caleb was utterly ignored. They gathered around Julian, praising his charm and generosity, his thoughtfulness and attention to detail. Caleb was an invisible man standing in the corner, watching their happy little group. When it was time for a group photo, Caleb started to move closer, hoping to avoid the awkwardness of being left out. But Chloe shoved the camera into his hands. Dad, you don't fit in with us. You should take the picture. Numbly, Caleb raised the camera. Through the lens, he saw Victoria linking her arm through Julian's. Chloe leaned against Julian affectionately, while Victoria's parents beamed. The scene was identical to the photograph that had literally been the death of him in his past life. The moment the shutter clicked, Caleb's hands trembled so violently he could barely hold the camera. He bit his lip so hard he tasted blood, just to keep the tears from falling. On the way down the mountain, the 3 cars were perfectly full. You can find your own way back, Victoria said without a backward glance, before getting into a car and shutting the door. Caleb walked alone down the winding mountain road, the hot sun making him dizzy. His legs ached until he could barely move. He ended up dragging his exhausted body onto the last bus back to the city. When he finally got home, there wasn't a single word of concern, not a shred of guilt. Just orders. "Iron my suit," Victoria said, tossing the designer outfit on a chair in front of him. "Clean up my toys," Chloe demanded, kicking a pile of dolls and blocks toward his feet. In that instant, the resentment and anger of 2 lifetimes finally erupted. "Victoria, let's get a divorce." His voice wasn't loud, but it struck the living room like a thunderclap. Victoria and Chloe froze, identical looks of disbelief on their beautiful faces. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" Victoria's voice was ice. "I'm perfectly clear." Caleb lifted his head, meeting her gaze directly. "I want a divorce." They thought he was playing games, bluffing. They called their lawyer with matching smirks. "Regretting it now, aren't you?" Chloe looked at him with contempt, her small face filled with a coldness that didn't belong to a child. "It's not too late to take it back. Apologize to us right now, and Mom and I will pretend we never heard it." But Caleb just smiled. He picked up the pen and, without a moment's hesitation, signed his name on the divorce papers. This time he was done with them. "You." Victoria and Chloe's eyes widened, shocked that he had actually signed. "What's the waiting period?" Caleb asked the lawyer directly. 30 days, the lawyer said, adjusting his glasses. "If you change your mind during that time, you can withdraw the petition." Hearing this, Victoria and Chloe both visibly relaxed. They exchanged a glance, their superior expressions returning. "Huh, so you were just bluffing," Chloe said, crossing her arms. Her childish voice was laced with malice. "You better actually be gone in 30 days, Daddy. Don't come crawling back, begging Mom to take you back. How pathetic would that be?" Caleb's heart felt like it was being crushed by an invisible hand. This was his daughter, looking at him as if he were her enemy. "Don't worry," he heard himself say, his voice surprisingly calm. "The second I have that decree in my hand, I'll be gone. I won't stay a minute longer." Victoria scoffed. "You're putting on a good act." She took a step closer, the subtle scent of cedarwood that had once captivated him, now turning his stomach. "We'll see if you're still talking so tough in 30 days. Caleb took a deep breath, about to reply, when the crisp ring of a cell phone cut through the tension. Victoria glanced at the caller ID, and the corners of her mouth lifted involuntarily. It was Julian. "Julian, what's wrong?" "Victoria, I'm not feeling well." Julian's weak voice came through the phone. "What's wrong? Where are you?" "I'm on my way." Chloe was already on her feet, her face etched with worry, all traces of her earlier coldness gone. "Don't worry, you two are busy. We're coming now," Victoria said, already grabbing her coat without a single glance at Caleb. "Wait for me." The call ended, and mother and daughter rushed for the door. At the threshold, Chloe turned back and stuck her tongue out at Caleb. Naya, I'm going to see Uncle Julian. He's a million times better than you." The door slammed shut. Caleb stood frozen in place, feeling the blood in his veins slowly turn to ice. He mechanically folded the divorce papers, went upstairs, and started to pack. His side of the closet was filled with dresses and coats he'd bought for Victoria, each one chosen with care. The bookshelf was lined with picture books and educational toys for Chloe, every single one picked out by him. In his last life, his world had revolved entirely around them. He had forgotten himself. This time, he was going to change everything. The next day, Caleb went to the most expensive salon in Midtown. When the stylist asked what he wanted, he looked at the haggard man in the mirror and said softly, "Cut it all off. I'm starting over." 3 hours later, he walked out with a sharp, stylish haircut, his hair dyed a soft chestnut brown. Next was the department store. He tried on all the clothes he'd never dared to wear because they weren't practical for a stay-at-home dad, finally settling on a bright blue technical jacket and black cargo pants. When he stood in front of the full-length mirror, he barely recognized himself. The man looking back was young and vibrant. There wasn't a trace of the weary stay-at-home dad left. That evening, Caleb walked into a Michelin-star restaurant. As the host led him to a table, he suddenly froze. Seated at a table by the window were Victoria, Chloe, and Julian, laughing and talking together. "That family over there, aren't they just perfect?" the host said, following his gaze with a smile. "The lady brings her husband and daughter here every so often. The two of them just adore him. It's enough to make anyone jealous." Caleb's heart clenched violently. He was about to ask for a table far away from them, but Julian, with his sharp eyes, had already spotted him. His eyes widened in surprise, clearly not expecting to see Caleb dressed like this. Victoria and Chloe were stunned, too. It was the first time they had ever seen this Caleb. The modern clothes, the sharp haircut, the aura of confidence radiating from him. What are you doing here? Chloe demanded, her surprise quickly morphing into a scowl. Aren't you divorcing Mom? Why are you following us? Caleb clenched his phone, his nails digging into his palm. Divorce doesn't mean I can't eat. And I'm not following you. It's a coincidence. He turned to leave. Don't go, Julian said, grabbing his wrist. Since we ran into each other, you should join us. Though, this is all my favorite food. He looked apologetically at Victoria. Victoria, could you order something for Caleb? Victoria frowned, flipping through the menu, then paused. She looked up at Caleb, her brow furrowed. What? Do you like to eat? Caleb wanted to laugh. He had learned to cook from scratch to make them balanced meals. He had scoured cookbooks to find new dishes for a picky Chloe. He had simmered special broths every day for Victoria's sensitive stomach. But after 5 years of marriage, they didn't even know his favorite food. Don't worry about him, Chloe interjected. Uncle Julian, your steak is getting cold. I'll order for myself. He took the menu and ordered the foie gras and beef bourguignon, dishes he loved but had never ordered, deeming them too extravagant. Mother and daughter stared at him in surprise. Chloe couldn't help but ask, Dad, where did you get the money for this? Don't forget, I'm part of this family too. Half of those billions are legally mine, Caleb said calmly. I used to focus all my attention and money on you too. Now, I'd like to be a little kinder to myself. Victoria's frown deepened. What exactly are you trying to do? Eat dinner, Caleb said, looking her straight in the eye, and then wait for the 30-day waiting period to end so I can leave your lives for good. Just as he finished speaking, a waiter approached with their food. But as he neared the table, his foot slipped and a tureen of scalding hot soup flew through the air, heading straight for them. In a flash, Caleb watched as Victoria, without a moment's hesitation, threw herself in front of Julian. And him? He had no one to protect him. The boiling liquid splashed across his arm and chest, the pain searing and immediate. Ah, he cried out instinctively. But before he could even process the pain, Chloe was scrambling over, shoving him to the floor. Get out of the way. He hit the ground hard, his elbow cracking against the tile. The fresh blisters on his arm ruptured, oozing fluid and blood, but Chloe didn't even look at him. She scrambled directly to Julian. Uncle Julian, are you okay? Does it hurt? She was sobbing, her little hands hovering over Julian, wanting to touch him, but afraid to. Victoria's eyes were locked on Julian, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. Are you burned? Let me see. They crowded around him, fussing over him, dabbing at his skin with napkins as if he were a priceless, fragile treasure. And Caleb lay on the floor, the skin on his arm and chest already red and blistering, but no one turned to look at him once. This is all your fault. Chloe suddenly whirled on him, her small face twisted with hatred. You're a jinx. If you hadn't insisted on following us, Uncle Julian wouldn't have moved to make room for you. And if he hadn't moved, he wouldn't have gotten hurt. Victoria shot him a cold glare, the kind one reserves for a criminal. Are you satisfied now? As they helped Julian leave, Chloe turned back to shout, You should just disappear forever. The other diners stared and pointed. Someone offered him a napkin. He heard whispers. That poor man. Caleb used the table to pull himself up. The blisters on his arm were already swelling, shiny and tight, but he couldn't feel the pain anymore. Caleb took a cab to the hospital alone. After an examination, the doctor frowned. The burns are showing signs of infection. You'll need to be admitted for a few days for observation. He nodded and calmly filled out the paperwork. During his stay, it was as if Victoria and Chloe had vanished from the face of the earth. No calls, no texts, not even a perfunctory message of concern. The nurses at the station, however, were full of gossip. That mother and daughter in the VIP suite really doted on their husband. He only got a tiny red spot from a burn, and they're acting like it's the end of the world. I know, right? They're feeding him water by hand, and even ordered the best burn cream from overseas. They're terrified he'll have a scar. Caleb paid it no mind, until one day, on his way to get a scan, he passed the VIP suite. Through the partially open door, he saw the scene inside. Victoria was sitting by the bed, her long fingers carefully applying ointment to Julian's arm. Chloe held a glass of warm water, waiting eagerly to help him drink. Julian looked embarrassed. I'm almost healed. You two should go check on Caleb. Isn't he still making a fuss about the divorce? Victoria didn't even look up, her tone dismissive. He's just using the divorce to threaten us. He'd never actually go through with it. Chloe let out a snort of derision. Exactly. He loves Mom and me so much. His whole life is about us. He probably couldn't survive without us. Julian sighed. Maybe he's really hurt this time. Aren't you going to try and placate him? No need, Victoria said, her certainty chilling. Give him a few days to cool off. It's always been like this. In the end, he's always the first one to apologize. Caleb stood outside the door, digging his fingernails into his palm. So that's what it was. Every compromise, every concession, every single one of his humiliating apologies to them, it was all just a pathetic game. But not this time. Not ever again. On his way back to his room, he ran into Julian in the hallway. Julian saw him, paused for a second, then offered a gentle smile. Caleb, Victoria, and Chloe want to get me some lunch. Do you have a minute? I like to talk. Caleb looked at him, suddenly curious to hear what this man had to say. The sunlight in the hospital garden was warm. Julian gazed at a large, leafy tree, his tone nostalgic. Victoria and I met in college. Once, she ran all over the city just to buy me a pair of limited edition sneakers. When I had a fever, she stayed by my side for 3 days and 3 nights. I once mentioned offhand that I was craving food from a French place on the west side, but complained it was too far. She bought the restaurant and had the chef on call to cook for me whenever I wanted. After that, he cooked only for me. Caleb listened in silence, his heart clenching. So Victoria knew how to love someone. She just didn't love him. He had lived with her for 50 years in his past life, and she could never even remember his birthday. But Julian gets a tiny burn, and she acts like the sky is falling. I moved abroad after graduation, and we lost touch. It's only recently that we've gotten close again. Julian glanced at Caleb's pale face, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. But don't worry, we're just old friends. We only grab a meal together occasionally. Don't get the wrong idea. Caleb mastered his expression and looked up, his voice level. I won't. I've already filed for divorce. Whether you two want to have dinner, travel, or get married and start a family, it has nothing to do with me. He turned to leave, but Julian suddenly grabbed his arm. Caleb, you've really misunderstood. Listen to me. Before he could finish, his foot slipped, and he fell backward, pulling Caleb down with him into the garden's decorative pool. Splash! The cold water closed over Caleb's head. He didn't know how to swim. He thrashed wildly as water flooded his nose and mouth, choking him. Through his blurry vision, he saw Victoria sprinting toward them. She jumped in without hesitation and pulled Julian from the water. Chloe ran over with a towel, dabbing at Julian's face, not sparing a single glance for Caleb, who was still struggling in the pool. Uncle Julian, are you okay? Help! Me! Caleb choked out, his fingers scrabbling at the edge of the pool. But Victoria just shot him a cold, disgusted look. Did you push him in on purpose? Caleb was trembling, his lips moving, trying to explain, but Chloe cut him off impatiently. Mom, I saw it. It was him. Forget him. He deserves it. A kind bystander started to step forward, but Chloe blocked their path. Don't save him. That's my dad. He deserves to drown. Caleb's heart turned to ice. The water washed over his head again, the lack of air overwhelming him. His consciousness began to fade. When he woke up, the hospital room was empty. It was just him. Caleb slowly sat up, picked up his phone, and booked a one-way ticket out of the city. The airline called to confirm his itinerary. Yes, he said calmly, leaving in 7 days. Just as he hung up, the door to his room swung open. Victoria and Chloe stood in the doorway, staring at him. Where do you think you're going now? Caleb looked at the mother and daughter standing in his hospital room doorway, his expression serene. Since we're getting divorced, I'm obviously leaving to start a new life. Victoria and Chloe exchanged a look of disbelief. Dad, stop it, Chloe said, frowning impatiently. You're just doing all this to get our attention, right? Victoria's gaze was just as cold. Enough is enough. He couldn't be bothered to explain anymore. Believe whatever you want. They clearly didn't take him seriously. Victoria issued a command. Go apologize to Julian. He looked up at her. I didn't do anything wrong. Why should I apologize? Victoria's eyes flashed with anger. You hurt him, and you still feel no remorse? Caleb suddenly laughed, a raw, broken sound that made his eyes sting. In your minds, will you always side with Julian? Do my feelings mean absolutely nothing to you? Of course, Chloe said without hesitation. Uncle Julian is worldly and charming and fun. What do you have to compare with him? You're just a stay-at-home dad who smells like a kitchen. Her young face was twisted with contempt. No matter what happens, it's always going to be your fault. Victoria added coldly. You're paranoid and suspicious. You disrespect Julian, you make mistakes and refuse to admit them. You have no class. She shot him a disgusted look. A father like you will be a terrible influence on our child. With that, she took Chloe's hand and turned to leave. Before the door closed, Chloe glared back at him. You better go apologize right now. The door slammed shut. Caleb sat on the hospital bed, a crushing weight on his chest that made it hard to breathe. But this time, he didn't cry. He looked out the window at the bright sunlight, and suddenly smiled. If they loved Julian so much, then let it be Victoria's husband. Let it be Chloe's father. As for Caleb, he would never give them another ounce of himself again. Caleb spent a few more days in the hospital. His wounds slowly healed, but no one came to visit. He no longer cared. The day he was discharged happened to be his birthday. He stood at the hospital entrance, the sunlight warm on his face. He suddenly remembered his past life. For 50 years, he had hoped, but Victoria and Chloe had never once remembered his birthday. Sometimes he'd cook an elaborate meal, but they would either come home late or not at all. Even when he called and begged them to come back, they'd just pick at the food, not even bothering to say happy birthday. Reborn, he had no more expectations. He went to a bakery and bought himself a small cream cake. Back in the empty, silent mansion, he stuck a candle in it and gently closed his eyes. This life, I will live for myself. The moment the candle went out, the front door was pushed open. "Sir, Ms. Thompson sent me to pick you up." Caleb looked up to see Victoria's assistant standing in the doorway, a professional smile plastered on her face. "Pick me up." He frowned. "For what?" The assistant's smile didn't waver. "It's your birthday today, Ms. Thompson, and the young miss have prepared a surprise for you." Caleb froze, then let out a cold laugh. "You've made a mistake." "There's no mistake," the assistant said confidently. "Today is May 20th, your birthday, Ms. Thompson was very specific. Caleb stared at her for a few seconds, a sense of absurdity washing over him. "Victoria, remember his birthday?" But the assistant was so certain, even stepping forward to help him up. "Sir, the car is waiting. We shouldn't keep Miss Thompson waiting." Before he could protest further, she was ushering him out the door and into a waiting car, citing that they were short on time. The car pulled up in front of a lavish hotel ballroom. The moment he pushed the doors open, Caleb was stunned. The entire hall was decorated in a beautifully romantic theme. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant glow, and on the wall was a projection of a family portrait Chloe had drawn of the three of them. On the cake table, an elaborate two-tiered cake was adorned with candles shaped like the number 28. As he entered, guests swarmed him, offering warm wishes. "Happy birthday, Mr. Thompson. Ms. Thompson and your daughter are so thoughtful. You're a lucky man." Caleb stood there, feeling as if he were in a dream. He looked around blankly at the assistant. "Where are Victoria and Chloe?" The assistant smiled. "They'll be here any moment. Why don't you open your gift first, sir?" She handed him an elegant box. The crowd urged him on, and after a moment's hesitation, Caleb lifted the lid. A diamond watch rested on a velvet cushion, the main stone catching the light and throwing off dazzling flashes. "Oh my God, isn't that the Starfall diamond from last month's auction? I heard it went for 8 figures. Ms. Thompson spoils her husband so much. No wonder he was willing to give up his career. I would too for that." Amid the envious murmurs, the assistant smiled and fastened the watch on his wrist. "Try it on, sir." Caleb stood there in a daze. The cold diamonds touched his skin. Could this be real? He almost allowed himself to believe it. But in the next second, the ballroom doors were thrown open. "Who told you that you could wear that watch?" Victoria's icy voice cut through the warm atmosphere like a blade. Caleb turned to see Victoria, Chloe, and Julian. All three stood in the doorway, their faces dark with anger. Chloe charged forward and ripped the watch from his wrist. Hiss! The sharp clasp scraped his skin, leaving a bloody scratch. Caleb clutched his wrist, the sting of pain yanking him back to reality. What kind of game are you playing?" he asked, his voice trembling. Chloe glared at him with disgust. "I should be asking you that. This is the birthday party Mom and I planned for Uncle Julian. Who told you to come?" Caleb froze. The guests fell silent, exchanging confused glances. Victoria spoke, her voice frigid. "Today is Julian's birthday. This party is for him." Caleb suddenly started to laugh. Of course, the assistant had gotten it wrong. This party was never for him. It made a sick kind of sense. Who, after all, would ever guess that on a day they shared a birthday, she would choose to celebrate Julian's instead of his? The guests' expressions shifted from envy to pity. Someone whispered, "Well, this is awkward." Caleb took a deep breath and turned to leave. "Caleb," Julian suddenly called out, his voice soft. "Since it's such a coincidence, why don't you celebrate with us?" Caleb didn't look back. "No, thank you." Julian immediately put on a wounded expression and looked at Victoria. "Did I offend your husband? He seems to really dislike me." Victoria's eyes narrowed. She strode forward and blocked Caleb's path. "Julian was kind enough to invite you. Why the attitude?" Chloe ran over and grabbed his arm. "Yeah, weren't you always complaining about wanting a birthday party? Why are you throwing a tantrum now?" Caleb looked at them, the absurdity of it all hitting him like a physical blow. I was complaining? He gave a short, bitter laugh. When have I ever done that? Victoria frowned. Stop being so dramatic and stay. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Caleb closed his eyes. Finally, under the pitying gazes of the entire room, he was forced to stay. He sat in a corner, watching Victoria and Chloe circle Julian, cutting his cake, giving him gifts, their smiles so tender they were blinding. And him? No one paid him any mind. When it was time to cut the cake, Julian suddenly walked over and took his hand warmly. Caleb, let's cut it together. Caleb tried to pull his hand away, but Julian's grip was tight. In the next second, crash! Someone knocked over the champagne tower next to them. A cascade of glass and liquid came crashing down. Victoria's first instinct was to shield Julian, and Caleb was showered with flying glass, cutting his arms and face before he fell hard to the floor. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, blurring his vision. As his consciousness faded, the last thing he saw was Victoria and Chloe frantically checking Julian for injuries, while he lay in a pool of his own blood, completely ignored. When Caleb woke up, the wound on his forehead throbbed. Victoria and Chloe were standing by his bed, watching him coldly. Victoria's voice was low. That day, you did it on purpose, didn't you? Caleb was stunned for a moment, then realized they thought he had deliberately ruined Julian's birthday party. He pulled at the corner of his mouth, his voice hoarse. How long have I even known Julian? How could I have known his birthday in advance to sabotage it? Victoria frowned, clearly unconvinced. The assistant rushed forward to explain. Ms. Thompson, it was my fault. I got the dates mixed up and brought him here by mistake. The mother and daughter reluctantly accepted this explanation, but Chloe still glared at him. You should learn your place. Don't ever ruin one of our surprises for Uncle Julian again. With that, they turned and left without another word of concern. Caleb watched them go and gently closed his eyes. There wouldn't be a next time. After his discharge, Caleb returned to the mansion, but completely ignored the mother and daughter. When Victoria couldn't find a file, or Chloe threw a tantrum for cake, he directed them to the housekeeper, not even bothering to look at them. It was the first time they had ever been so thoroughly ignored by him, and they didn't know how to react. Victoria would frown at him, looking like she wanted to say something, but would ultimately leave with a cold expression. Chloe was even more incensed, deliberately breaking things and complaining loudly in front of him, but Caleb didn't so much as raise an eyebrow. The atmosphere in the house was glacial, but Caleb didn't care. He just wanted to leave. Until one evening, when Chloe demanded to go see a meteor shower. Dad, take me to see the meteors. Chloe tugged at his sleeve, her tone as imperious as a tiny monarch. Right now. Caleb gently pulled his arm away, his eyes still on his book. No. If you don't take me, I'll ask Uncle Julian to take me. She threatened, pouting. Caleb turned a page, his voice terrifyingly calm. Go ahead. A few hours later, his phone rang. The name, Victoria, glowed on the screen, stark in the darkness. Get to the hospital. Now. Her voice was like frozen steel. Caleb glanced at the time. 2:15 in the morning. No. You'll regret it if you don't. The line went dead. Caleb was silent for a moment before finally getting up and going to the hospital. He didn't want any more complications before the divorce was final. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor were stark and blinding. When Caleb pushed open the door to the room, he found Chloe lying on the bed, her small leg in a cast, her face dotted with fresh scrapes. Bad daddy, it's all your fault. The moment she saw him, Chloe started wailing, her face a mask of resentment. Caleb froze. Victoria grabbed his wrist, her grip so tight he thought the bones might snap. What kind of father are you? You take her to see a meteor shower in the middle of the night, and the second you see a snake, you just run away and leave her on a mountain alone. Her voice was thick with suppressed rage. Do you have any idea she could have been killed? Caleb's eyes widened in disbelief. He stared at Chloe. You told her I took you? Chloe's eyes darted away as she sobbed even harder. Who else could it have been? It was you. This happened because of you. The blood drained from Caleb's face. Chloe, don't you dare lie. Julian was the one who took you. He was furious, ready to lay out the whole truth, but Victoria cut him off with a sharp command. Enough. You made a mistake, and now you're trying to pin it on Julian. Her eyes were filled with disgust. He would never be as cruel as you. She motioned to her bodyguards, her voice cold. Take him to the basement. Lock him in there to reflect. No food for 3 days. As the bodyguards dragged him from the room, Caleb looked back one last time. A smile played on his lips, but his eyes were red-rimmed and raw. The expression was so complex, part relief, part utter despair, that it sent an inexplicable shiver down Victoria's spine. Chloe froze too, her small hand unconsciously tightening its grip on her mother's clothes. But in the end, neither of them said a word. He was locked in a pitch-black room. On Chloe's instructions, the guards threw in snakes and rats and cranked the air conditioning down to its lowest setting. Caleb curled up in a corner, his thin shirt soaked with sweat. In the darkness, he could hear the hiss of snakes and the scuttling of rats. A tide of fear washed over him, but he was too weak to even scream. This was the punishment from the woman he had loved for so many years and the daughter he had adored. 3 days later, when they finally let him out, he was a hollowed-out version of himself. His face was ghostly pale, his lips cracked and bleeding. The sound of a piano drifted from the living room. Julian was teaching Chloe how to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The little girl sat obediently on the bench, her face a picture of concentration, with none of the malice she'd shown him. Victoria stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sunlight tracing her silhouette in gold. She gazed at the pair at the piano, a gentle smile on her face that Caleb had never seen before. Caleb leaned against the wall, a sudden bitter amusement rising in him. He had tried so desperately to be part of this family, yet he had always been an outsider. And now, he was finally ready to step aside and let them have their perfect picture. On the final day of the divorce waiting period, Caleb woke up early. He made himself a lavish breakfast, a perfectly fried golden egg, crispy toast, and a steaming mug of milk. Chloe ran into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. Her little nose twitched. "That smells good. I want some." Caleb calmly put down his fork. "There's none left." "Then make me some tomorrow." Chloe pouted, ordering him as if it were her right. "There won't be any more tomorrow. Or ever again." His voice was soft, but it severed every last tie between them. Chloe stared at him, stunned, then began to throw a full-blown tantrum. "Why won't you cook for me? You're a bad daddy." Victoria, drawn by the noise, came in with a deep frown. "Must you argue with a child?" She looked down at Caleb. "Don't you think it's pathetic for a father to bully his own daughter?" Caleb met her gaze, his expression unreadable. Is stating a fact considered bullying now? The finality in his eyes unsettled her. She was about to press him, but Chloe was already pulling her toward the door. "Mommy, let's go find Uncle Julian. He could do anything. He's so much better than Daddy." Caleb watched them grab their keys, finally speaking up. "Wait, today is the last day of the waiting period. Aren't you coming with me to finalize the divorce?" Chloe's shouting drowned him out. "Mommy, let's go." At that exact moment, Julian's call came through. "Victoria, Chloe mentioned she wanted tiramisu. I just learned how to make it with the housekeeper. Do you want to come try some?" Victoria's expression softened instantly. "Okay, we're on our way." She didn't even glance at Caleb as she led Chloe out the door. The moment the mansion door closed, Caleb let out a self-deprecating laugh. It seemed he'd be finalizing this divorce by himself. At the county clerk's office, the official handed Caleb 2 copies of the divorce decree. "Your wife didn't come?" "She's busy." He smiled, placing 1 copy in his bag. Back at the house, he left the other copy on the living room coffee table. Then he picked up the suitcase he'd packed long ago and, without a backward glance, walked out of the home he had lived in for 10 years. In the cab to the airport, he watched the city blur past his window and suddenly remembered the scene from his deathbed. He was lying there, dying, while Victoria and Chloe fussed over Julian, not even sparing him a final look. This time, he would start a new life. Not as someone's husband, not as someone's father, just as himself. It was dark when Victoria returned to the mansion. The living room was silent. There was no familiar smell of dinner cooking, no Caleb rushing to greet her. She frowned, tossing her coat onto the sofa. "Caleb," she called out coldly. No one answered. Her frown deepened. She strode into the kitchen, but found it empty and cold. Not even a glass of water had been left out for her. "Where is he?" she muttered, turning and heading upstairs. The bedroom door was ajar. She pushed it open, expecting to see Caleb quietly organizing clothes, but the room was empty, the bed made with military precision. The closet door was open. She walked over and saw that more than half of Caleb's clothes were gone. Only a few plain sets of house clothes hung there, looking forlorn. Her heart sank, and a strange, unfamiliar irritation washed over her. What is he playing at now? She scoffed, turning toward the study. But as she passed the coffee table, she stopped dead. A dark red document lay there. Next to it was a piece of paper with neat, steady handwriting. "The waiting period is over. The divorce is final. From now on, we are strangers." Victoria's pupils constricted. She snatched up the document and flipped it open. There, clear as day, was Caleb's name, stamped with the official seal of the court. He actually dared. Her fingers tightened, knuckles turning white, crinkling the official paper. She stared at the words on the note, a heavy weight settling in her chest, making it difficult to breathe. But a second later, she forced herself to calm down, a sarcastic smile twisting her lips. Such a drama queen. She tossed the decree back onto the table. He'll come crying back to me within 3 days, begging me to remarry him. She turned and went to take a shower, but the unsettling feeling of irritation wouldn't go away. The next morning, Chloe's crying shattered the mansion's silence. I don't want this. I want Daddy's fried eggs. The little girl kicked over a dining chair. On the plate in front of her was Julian's attempt at an egg, burnt black around the edges. Julian stood by, helpless. Chloe, it's Uncle's first time. I'll do better next time. Yours are disgusting. Chloe grabbed the plate and hurled it to the floor, shattering it into a dozen pieces. I want Daddy. Where did Daddy go? Victoria's head was pounding. She put down her coffee cup. Chloe, be quiet. Her mother's sharp tone made Chloe flinch, but her frustration only grew. Mommy, did Daddy leave us? Why isn't he coming back? Victoria's fingers tightened around her cup. Coffee sloshed over the rim, staining her sleeve. She stared at the dark spot, suddenly realizing that, in the past, Caleb would have been there instantly with a damp cloth, or would have already laid out a fresh change of clothes for her. But now, there was no one to take care of her. She frowned, annoyed, and said to Julian, just have the housekeeper make something. Julian bit his lip. Victoria, he said softly, do you think Caleb is really not coming back? Maybe. Maybe I should go talk to him. Don't bother, Victoria said with a sneer. He'll be back begging. But even as she said it, her eyes drifted toward the staircase, as if expecting to see a familiar figure appear. In the days that followed, the Thompson household descended into chaos. Victoria's clothes were no longer perfectly pressed. Chloe's homework went unchecked, prompting calls from her teacher. The dining table was no longer filled with hot, home-cooked meals, but with plastic takeout containers. Julian tried to take over Caleb's duties, but he couldn't even figure out the washing machine. He shrunk one of Victoria's couture dresses and dyed Chloe's school uniform a mottle gray. Victoria, I'm really trying my best, Julian said, his face a mask of innocence. Victoria looked at him, feeling an overwhelming wave of irritation. When Caleb was here, the house ran like a well-oiled machine. Every one of her dresses was perfectly pressed. Chloe's homework always had his notes in the margins, and he even bought gifts for her parents' birthdays in advance. Now everything was a mess. A few days later, Victoria finally snapped. She swept a pile of documents off her desk, roaring at her assistant. Find him, find Caleb, and bring him back to me. The assistant asked timidly, Ms. Thompson, you mean? Your husband. Who else? Victoria's eyes were dangerously dark. Tell him he's had his fun. He can come home now. I don't have the patience for his tantrums. After the assistant left, she sat at her desk, pressing her fingers to her temples. For the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, Caleb wasn't coming back. And it was all her fault. After leaving New York, Caleb rented an apartment in Los Angeles. It wasn't big, but it was enough for one person. He decided that this life would be for him alone. He would finally pursue his college passion, fashion design. The divorce settlement was more than enough to start over, and he immediately enrolled in the most prestigious design program in the city. In the studio, the soft scratching of pencil on paper was the only sound. He was completely focused on sketching the pleats of a skirt, oblivious to the charcoal dust smudging his clothes. As he stood up to get some paints, he accidentally bumped into someone, and a cup of coffee instantly spilled across his work. Oh, I'm so sorry. Watch out, a gentle female voice said from beside him. Caleb looked up and met a pair of apologetic eyes. The woman wore a pale, gray-knit sweater, her gaze soft. The overturned coffee cup in her hand was dripping dark brown liquid onto the table, seeping into the design sketch he had just finished. He instinctively reached for it, but his fingers only found a soggy mess. I am so sorry, the woman said, immediately dabbing at the stain with a napkin, her brow furrowed in concern. I wasn't paying attention and knocked your table. Is this for a class project? Caleb's heart sank as he looked at the ruined sketch, but he still shook his head. It's fine. I'll just draw it again. I'll compensate you, the woman said guiltily, carefully trying to clean up the mess. But as she did, her eyes caught on the lines of the design that weren't completely obscured. Wait a second, she said softly. She carefully lifted the stained portion of the paper. This tailoring concept is very unique. Is this your own idea? Caleb was taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to notice the subtle complexities of the design. He'd poured a lot of thought into it, but the other students in his class had called his style too conservative. "You can see that?" he asked, taking a proper look at her for the first time. She smiled and pulled a business card from her bag. "I didn't introduce myself. I'm Lena Jiang, today's guest lecturer. As an apology, if you don't mind, I can put you in touch with professional fabric suppliers or help with anything else you might need." As Caleb took the card, he noticed a small smudge of paint on the base of her thumb. He couldn't believe his luck. He had long admired her work. "Well, thank you. Call me anytime you need anything." Lena smiled at him before leaving the studio. He never expected to see her again so soon. The next day, at the program's first design review, Caleb's series of modified blazers was projected onto the main screen. "The color palette is too muted," the head critic said with a frown. "We need a stronger visual impact." Caleb gripped his pen, about to defend his work, when a clear, familiar voice came from the back of the room. "I, on the other hand, find the use of color to be quite powerful." Lena stood up, her finger lightly tapping a detail on his projected design as she proceeded to point out its merits with well-reasoned arguments. The room was silent for a moment, then murmurs of agreement spread. The head critic cleared his throat awkwardly and ultimately gave Caleb the highest score in the class. After class, Lena caught him in the hallway. "Your work is truly special. I'm very impressed." She tilted her head slightly as she spoke, and he caught the scent of pine-scented paint. "Thank you." On impulse, Caleb pulled out his tablet. They stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows for an hour, discussing design, until the setting sun stretched their shadows long across the floor. "By the way, there's a special exhibit at the City Art Museum next week," Lena mentioned casually as they parted ways. "If you're interested, I have an extra ticket." Caleb felt a warmth creep up his neck, and he suddenly smiled. "Okay." His phone vibrated. It was a new message from Lena with a link to the exhibition. Below it was another line. "Your designs remind me of the masters, quiet but full of life. Keep going. I believe in you." Outside the window, the first new buds of spring were appearing on the sycamore trees. Caleb read the message over and over, feeling that his life, too, was finally starting to get better. Ever since Caleb had left, Julian, in an attempt to win over Victoria and Chloe, tried to emulate him by cooking for the first time. In the mansion's kitchen, Julian, wearing an apron, fumbled with a pan of ribs. Cooking wine, soy sauce, vinegar. He followed a recipe on his phone, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Chloe sat at the table, swinging her legs, watching him impatiently. "Uncle Julian, Mommy said Daddy used to put pineapple in it." Almost ready, Julian forced a smile, but the moment he turned his back, his expression soured with annoyance. Sure enough, as he turned, he knocked over a bottle of sauce. The dark liquid splashed into the pan, and in his haste to fix it, he grabbed a container of white powder from the counter and dumped it in. At dinner, Chloe took one bite and scrunched up her face. "Yucky. This is so yucky. I don't want it. I want the ribs Daddy makes." She threw a tantrum, and Julian, clenching his jaw, had no choice but to throw all the food away. That night, however, Chloe came down with a fever and began vomiting from food poisoning. The driver and housekeeper rushed her to the hospital. Chloe curled up on the bed, her forehead burning, her small hands clutching the sheets. The doctor removed his stethoscope, his tone stern. "Acute gastroenteritis brought on by food poisoning. She's just a child. You have to be extremely careful with her diet." Julian stood nearby, his face pale. He managed a weak smile. "I'm sorry, doctor, I wasn't paying attention." "Daddy, I want my daddy." Chloe whimpered in her delirium, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy's barbecue ribs don't make my tummy hurt." Julian's smile froze, his nails digging deep into his palms. Just then, Victoria arrived, rushing in from a late meeting, her expression a mixture of anxiety and exhaustion. She glanced at her daughter on the bed, then at Julian, her voice low. "What happened?" I was just trying to make her favorite barbecue ribs." Julian's voice grew quieter, his fingers twisting the hem of his shirt. "I think I might have used the wrong seasoning." Victoria didn't say anything. She walked to the bed and placed a hand on Chloe's forehead. The intense heat made her frown deepen. "When Caleb was here," she said flatly, "things like this never happened." Julian's head snapped up, a flash of humiliation and anger in his eyes, but he quickly lowered his gaze. "I'm sorry, Victoria. I was just trying so hard to help." Lately, with her endless social obligations, Victoria often didn't get back to the mansion until 2 or 3 in the morning. The house was always dark. There were no lights left on for her, no warm soup waiting to sober her up. She'd stand in the foyer, and for a fleeting moment, She'd imagined Caleb walking out of the kitchen with a glass of warm water, asking softly, "You're home?" But the illusion would always vanish. Victoria? Julian would come down from the second floor, still in his pajamas, his eyes heavy with sleep. "You've been drinking?" "It was a work dinner. Give me a glass of water." He'd hurry into the kitchen and return a moment later with a glass of ice water, his fingertips still damp. Victoria took the glass, the coldness making her frown. "Why is it cold?" Julian looked flustered. "Oh, I forgot to boil some." Victoria suddenly remembered that no matter how late she came home, there was always a glass of room-temperature water on the nightstand. If she was drunk, Caleb would silently bring her a hangover remedy and even hang her clothes for the next day on the back of the bathroom door. She didn't say anything, just turned and walked into her study. Sitting in her office chair, she stared at the ice cubes floating in her glass, an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. Caleb had always organized her files for her, everything in its proper place. But now, looking at the chaotic mess of papers piled on her desk, she rubbed her temples, overcome with an intense feeling of frustration. The next morning, Victoria found that Julian had tried to organize her study, but had misplaced every important document. She finally lost her temper, her voice sharp. "How can you not even handle something this simple?" Julian stood in the doorway, his face ashen. "I was just trying to help," he stammered. "I saw how Caleb used to do it." "Caleb?" Victoria let out a cold laugh, her eyes filled with scorn. "You can't even begin to compare yourself to him." Julian's head shot up, the hurt in his eyes instantly hardening into resentment. "He may have been so great, but he's gone now, isn't he?" he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "You're the one who pushed him away." With that, he stormed back to his room and slammed the door. Victoria froze, her fingers crumpling the document in her hand. He was right. If she hadn't driven Caleb away, he never would have left. Victoria walked downstairs, the cuffs of her blouse still stained with coffee. Without Caleb to iron her clothes, she just grabbed a wrinkled shirt from the closet. The old housekeeper stood by the kitchen, sighing quietly. This family, she thought, was finally starting to pay the price for losing Caleb. Victoria had people searching for Caleb for days, but there was no trace of him. Unwilling to give up, she practically moved into her office, dedicating all her resources to the search. One day, Victoria's assistant was working in a coffee shop when an arts and culture talk show on the TV caught her eye. As the camera panned across the audience, a familiar face flashed across the screen. The assistant shot to her feet, knocking over her coffee. "Caleb." She quickly snapped a picture of the screen. In the photo, Caleb, dressed in a simple white shirt, was focused on taking notes. And sitting next to him was the nationally renowned art professor, Lena Jiang. "He's a designer in Los Angeles?" Victoria stared at the photo her assistant showed her, her expression unreadable. "Yes, and—" The assistant hesitated. "It seems he's become quite close with Professor Jiang." Victoria's fingers tightened on the photo. He had a home to come back to, a life of luxury, but instead he runs off to another city to be a designer. What was he thinking? After a long pause, she gave a cold order. "Go buy the latest high-end design kit on the market, and that set of handmade Italian art pencils. Send them to him." If he wouldn't come back, she would shower him with gifts. She would make him remember how good he had it with her. That afternoon, the expensive gifts, beautifully wrapped, were delivered to Caleb's apartment. Caleb, just home from class, frowned at the boxes by his door. He opened one, saw the sender's address and name, and immediately closed it. He looked at the delivery person and said flatly, "Please return to sender." "But this is from Ms. Thompson," she specifically. "We're divorced." Caleb cut her off, his voice calm. "Please tell her not to contact me again." That night, Victoria stood by her office window, her voice like ice. "He refused the delivery?" The assistant kept her head down. "Yes. He also said that you're divorced and asked you not to contact him anymore." Victoria hurled her pen at the wall. It shattered on impact, splattering ink across the pristine white paint like a jagged wound. The study door opened quietly, and Julian entered with a cup of tea. "Victoria, don't be angry. Have some tea." Victoria ignored the cup. "This has nothing to do with you." Julian's smile faltered, but he persisted. He set down the tea and sighed dramatically. "Caleb is really something else. He just got divorced, and he's already so close with another woman. Do you think he had this planned all along?" He looked at her expectantly, waiting for her to agree with him, as she always did. But this time, Victoria was silent. She thought of the way Caleb used to wake up at dawn to iron her shirts. The way he looked, exhausted, when he'd wait up for her to come home from a late dinner. The way he would silently endure Chloe's tantrums with a patient smile. "That's enough," she said suddenly, her voice hoarse. He's not that kind of person. Julian stared at her in disbelief, his nails digging into his palms. Late that night, Julian sat alone in the guest room, his reflection in the mirror twisted with jealousy. Why? He clutched his phone. I've put in so much effort, but I still can't compare to him. He scrolled through the photos a private investigator had taken of Caleb and Lena laughing in a coffee shop, a venomous idea taking root in his mind. The next morning at breakfast, he accidentally dropped his phone in front of Victoria. Oops, he said, feigning panic as he snatched it up, but the screen was frozen on that exact photo. Victoria's gaze locked onto it. In the picture, Caleb was wearing a light blue sweater she'd never seen before, his smile as bright as the morning sun. And the woman, Lena, was gently pushing a cup of coffee toward him. Julian watched her expression, sighing softly. Caleb seems to be doing so well. He found someone new so quickly. I said. Victoria's voice was raw, thick with suppressed fury. Don't mention him again. Julian flinched at her glare and finally fell silent. But as he looked down, a triumphant smile touched his lips. That night, Victoria stood alone on the balcony, the cold moonlight glinting off her whiskey glass. She suddenly remembered their wedding day, when Caleb had asked her, "Do you really care about me?" At the time, she had impatiently turned away, thinking he was just being needy again. But now, she realized she truly didn't have an answer. All those years of marriage, and she had never really known him at all. The night wind blew past. She tilted her head back and downed the whiskey in one go, but did nothing to quell the fire of irritation in her chest. In the distance, the city lights sparkled. One of them, she knew, would never be lit for her again. In the days Caleb was gone, there was no one to pick Chloe up from school. Victoria was always too busy, and Julian was only interested in video games, so the task fell to the driver. But recently, Chloe seemed more and more reluctant to go to school at all. One afternoon, Chloe stood at the kindergarten gate, her eyes red, her expression a mix of hurt and defiance. A group of children were pointing at her, their laughter sharp and cruel. "Chloe doesn't have a daddy," a chubby boy jeered. "My mommy says her daddy doesn't want her anymore." "You're a liar." Chloe lunged at him, and the two of them tumbled to the ground in a heap of flailing limbs. The fight escalated until a teacher finally rushed over and pulled them apart. For the first time, Victoria was called into the school. She was in the middle of a board meeting when the call came. When she arrived and heard her daughter had been bullied, her anger boiled over. She had her bodyguards see to it that the little boy's parents lost their jobs, avenging her daughter's tears. But the root of the problem remained unsolved. Kayla was really gone. On the drive home, Chloe huddled in the back seat, her tears soaking the collar of her jacket. Victoria watched her in the rearview mirror, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Chloe looked up, sniffling. "Mommy, can we go find Daddy?" The woman in the driver's seat didn't answer. The next day, at dusk, outside the design school, sycamore leaves spiraled to the ground. Victoria stood across the street, holding Chloe's hand, and watched the figure emerge from the glass doors. Caleb was wearing a black trench coat, his hair moving slightly with each step. The slender woman beside him was saying something, her head tilted, a gentle smile on her face. As she spoke, Caleb suddenly laughed. How long had it been since Victoria had seen him laugh so freely? "Daddy!" Chloe tore herself from her mother's grasp and shot across the street like a tiny cannonball. Caleb stumbled back, looking down to find his daughter sobbing, her face a mess. Chloe clung to his leg, wiping tears and snot all over his jeans. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'll never say I hate you again. Please come home." Passing students stared. Lena tactfully took a step back to give him space, but she watched as Caleb slowly knelt. He gently wiped Chloe's tears with a handkerchief, his voice calm and even. "Chloe, Daddy has his own life now. I'm not coming back. You and Mommy need to take care of each other." At his words, Chloe's face crumpled. Victoria was suddenly standing right in front of them. Her eyes were fixed on the faint, pale line on Caleb's ring finger where his wedding band used to be. She grabbed his wrist. "Caleb, have you had enough of this game? The child is so young. How can you be so cruel? I will never agree to this divorce. You're coming home with me." Lena frowned and took a subtle step forward, positioning herself between them. Her gentle voice held an unyielding strength. "Ma'am, please respect his wishes." Victoria's eyes were bloodshot, the muscles in her arm tense. "This is a private family matter. It's none of your business." Caleb gently pushed Chloe toward Lena and stepped directly in front of them. He looked up at his ex-wife, his voice soft, but his words struck Victoria like a bolt of lightning. "Legally, we are no longer a family. You have a short memory, Ms. Thompson." Do I need to remind you who signed the divorce papers? She stared into Caleb's calm eyes and suddenly realized how much of a stranger he had become. The man whose world once revolved around her was gone, and in his place was someone she didn't know at all. A child needs her father. She choked out a last, desperate plea. Caleb bent down, straightened Chloe's collar, and gently pushed her toward Victoria. Then I suggest you find her a new one. In the early hours of the morning, the mansion was littered with empty liquor bottles. Victoria was slumped on the sofa, staring at the divorce decree on the coffee table, the alcohol burning her throat. She couldn't stop replaying the image of Lena shielding Caleb and his instinctive little gesture of grabbing her sleeve, a habit he only had when he was nervous. It had only taken a month for someone to replace her. A clap of thunder outside lit up the smiling faces in the photo on the crumpled document in her hand. The whiskey bottle smashed against the wall, amber liquid running down it like a long-overdue penance. With Victoria gone for days on end, Julian's resentment toward Caleb grew. He was stuck taking care of the annoying child, Chloe, and Victoria never answered his calls. He couldn't stand it. He had worked so hard to get into this family, only to be ignored again. He had to do something to make Caleb disappear for good. Julian stood around a corner in the design school hallway, staring at Caleb's busy figure in the studio. Caleb was preparing his entry for a competition, a gown that blended traditional embroidery with a modern silhouette. The delicate stitching on the skirt shimmered under the lights. In 2 days, it would be sent to an international design competition. Julian's nails dug into his palms. Why him? He muttered, watching Caleb's focused profile, a venomous glint in his eyes. He's nothing but a cast-off, a charity case who married up. Why does he deserve to be happy? During the empty lunch break, he slipped into the studio. Pretending to stumble into a workstation, he accidentally splashed a container of paint onto the gown. What are you doing? A cool female voice sounded from behind him. Julian whipped around to see Lena's sharp, assessing gaze. His hand jerked, spilling the rest of the paint across the skirt. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'll help you clean it, he said, frantically pulling out a tissue. But he deliberately scrubbed hard, snagging the delicate embroidery and pulling several threads loose. Seeing her cold stare, Julian grew flustered. It was an accident. Lena let out a humorless laugh. She grabbed his wrist, her eyes flicking up to the security camera in the corner of the room. I think the security footage will tell us whether it was an accident or not. The color drained from his face. In the design school's conference room, a pale-faced Julian sat staring at the looping security footage on the screen. It clearly showed him sneaking into the studio, deliberately spilling the paint, and then maliciously clawing at the embroidery with his fingernails. That's not real, he shrieked. You faked it. Caleb, you framed me, didn't you? The students gathered around began to whisper. Caleb stood to the side, calmly watching the man who had caused him so much pain unravel. I never thought you'd sink this low, Caleb said. I left, just like you wanted. Why can't you just let me go? Under the scornful gazes of everyone in the room, Julian's face went white. He grabbed his bag and fled. Word of the incident quickly reached Victoria. Late that night, in the CEO's office of the Thompson Corporation, Victoria stared at the blinking footage on her computer screen. It was from the home security system she had originally installed to keep an eye on Caleb. Now, it was revealing one cruel truth after another. There was Julian pretending to spill hot soup, but it was Caleb's arm that was burned. There was Julian accidentally letting slip Chloe's allergies, leading to Caleb being blamed by the whole family. There was Julian crying and playing the victim, but with a triumphant smirk on his face the moment he thought no one was looking. Victoria's hand began to tremble. All this time, he had been playing a part. What shocked her even more was the discovery of how much Caleb had sacrificed for their family. 3 years ago, when her company was on the brink of collapse, it was Caleb who had secretly sold off the inheritance his parents had left him to cover the shortfall. And where was she? She was overseas with Julian, tending to one of his so-called heart episodes. Crack! Her fist slammed down on the desk, sending a pen skittering to the floor. The mansion was brightly lit. Julian heard the front door open and rushed to greet her. Victoria, you're finally home. From now on, you will stay in the guest room. You're not to leave it. Victoria's voice was arctic. Julian froze. What? What do you mean? Do you need me to play the security footage for you? Victoria tossed a flash drive and a file onto the coffee table. Or should we talk about everything you've been doing for the past few years? One glance at the file on the table was enough. The color drained from Julian's face. He suddenly cried out, his voice full of anguish. Victoria, you're still thinking about him, aren't you? Ever since he left, you haven't even looked at me. Victoria remained unmoved by his histrionics. She looked down at the man she had once thought was kind and saw a complete stranger. "Security," she said, turning toward the stairs. "Pack his things and lock him in the guest room. He is not to leave without my permission." Julian's screams echoed behind her, but she had no desire to listen anymore. In her frantic attempts to win Caleb back, Victoria threw herself into her work, which meant she was rarely home. This gave the already resentful Julian, confined to the house, the perfect opportunity. He had only been pretending to be kind in the first place. With Victoria gone, he didn't even bother with the act. Whenever Chloe cried or did something to displease him, Julian would grab her arm, his nails digging into her soft skin. "What are you crying for?" He'd hiss, his face contorted with malice. "You think your daddy is going to come save you? He abandoned you." Chloe would bite her lip, tears welling in her eyes, too scared to make a sound. Julian would sneer and give her ear a vicious twist, just hard enough to make her tremble with pain, but not hard enough to leave a bruise. "Go get my slippers," he'd command, releasing her and enjoying the sight of her stumbling away. When she returned, he'd accidentally knock over a glass of water. "You clumsy little brat, clean it up." As Chloe knelt to wipe up the spill with her sleeve, he would step on her fingers. He'd grind the heel of his shoe into the back of her hand, his voice deceptively gentle. "Next time you even think about telling your mother, I'll lock you in the real basement." The room would fill with the child's terrified screams. The moment he heard the housekeeper's footsteps, his expression would shift to one of concern. "Chloe, what happened? Did you fall? Let Uncle help you up." The next day, Chloe cowered in a corner at school, clutching a crayon. On her drawing paper, Caleb was holding her hand in a field of flowers. "Chloe, why are there only 2 people in your picture?" her teacher asked softly. The little girl kept her head down, viciously scribbling a red line over the paper. "Mommy's bad. Uncle Julian is a bad man." Her voice dropped to a choked whisper. "I miss my daddy." The teacher sighed and gathered the small, trembling girl into her arms. That evening, outside his apartment building, Caleb was stopped by the sound of faint sobbing. "Daddy!" A small figure darted out from behind a bush. Her school uniform was filthy, her knees scraped raw. Chloe threw herself at him, clinging to his legs, shaking with sobs. "Daddy, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Her teacher stood behind her, looking guilty. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson." She wouldn't stop crying, saying she had to see you, so I brought her here. Caleb knelt down, but as Chloe flinched away, he gently took her wrist. Pushing back the sleeve, he saw them. A series of angry, crescent-shaped bruises on the tender skin of her forearm. "What is this?" His voice was suddenly dangerously quiet. Chloe shook her head, hiccuping. "Uncle Julian. He said if I told Mommy he hit me, he'd lock me in the dark." "That bastard." Caleb's expression hardened, his hatred for both of them solidifying into something cold and sharp. Lena silently handed him a wet wipe, her own face grim. In a child-friendly restaurant, Chloe devoured a plate of strawberry pancakes, a treat Caleb used to make for her every week. "Slow down," Caleb said, using his thumb to wipe cream from the corner of her mouth. The gesture was still gentle, but when he saw the hope in her eyes, he had to shake his head. "Chloe, Mommy and I are separated. We can go back to the way things were. But I will always love you. If you're ever in trouble, you can always come to me." Chloe's fork clattered onto her plate. She looked at Caleb, then at Lena, who had been watching over them with a quiet warmth, and she suddenly understood. Her father, through 1,000 tiny cuts, had finally lost all hope for their family. With tears in her eyes, Chloe silently finished the last of her pancakes. With Lena's guidance and connections, Caleb's design work started to gain recognition. His diligence, combined with his unique vision, allowed his bold designs to make a name for him in the fashion world. One day, Lena tapped on his desk. "Your collection was just nominated for a citywide award." "Really?" He looked up at her, a wide, surprised smile on his face. He stared at the invitation, finally feeling a sense of hard-won freedom. All the while, Lena's smiling gaze never left him. On the stage of the design competition, the spotlights shone down like a river of silver. Caleb stood next to his creation, a simple black and gold suit that perfectly highlighted his frame. He spoke with confidence and passion, sharing the inspiration behind his design. The applause was thunderous. The judges whispered amongst themselves, their eyes filled with admiration. "What strikes me most about this piece?" Lena, a guest judge, stood up, her gaze warm and focused on him, "is that the designer's entire collection reflects his own qualities, confident, fluid, and brilliant." Caleb met her eyes across the room, the corners of his mouth lifting into a smile. For the past month, she had been the one staying up with him in the studio until the early hours, helping him revise his sketches. It was her words, "You are more resilient than you know," that had finally given him the courage to put his own name, Caleb Thompson, on his work. Standing on that stage, looking at the woman who had been by his side through it all, her unwavering belief in him made his eyes burn. In the last row of the audience, Victoria clutched her own invitation. The moment she heard he'd been nominated, she had her assistant secure a seat. But seeing him now, it was nothing like she'd imagined. The radiant man on stage seemed to both overlap and completely shatter her memory of the man in an apron stirring a pot on the stove. The man in her memory was the one who did everything for her, the compliant stay-at-home dad. But this man was like a star, emitting his own brilliant light. She had never realized that underneath the smell of cooking oil and detergent, Caleb was so dazzling it was hard to look at him directly. Watching the intimate, knowing glances exchanged between him and Lena on stage, Victoria was seized by a suffocating wave of regret. She fled the auditorium. Victoria grabbed her car keys and rushed out, but she didn't know where to go. In the rearview mirror, she saw the reflection of a woman who had once had it all, her eyes now bloodshot and lost. That night, Victoria blocked the entrance to Caleb's studio. Her eyes were fixed on where Caleb and Lena's hands were clasped together, her throat raw. "We need to talk." Caleb just laughed. He held up his left hand, the bare ring finger stark and white under the fluorescent lights. "There's nothing left for us to talk about. Please move." As they walked away, Victoria stumbled backward, knocking over a potted plant by the door. Amid the crash of shattering ceramic, she heard her own hoarse voice calling after his retreating back. "Caleb, what will it take for you to come back to me?" The next morning at 7 o'clock sharp, Caleb's apartment doorbell rang. "Mr. Thompson, your breakfast." The delivery person handed him a high-end thermal container. Through the peephole, Caleb saw a familiar figure disappearing around the corner of the stairwell. He emotionlessly lifted the lid. It was the congee he used to make for Victoria's sensitive stomach, a recipe he had perfected over countless mornings. He looked at it for a second, then dumped the entire thing in the trash. For 7 straight days, a different delivery arrived for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. For 7 straight days, it all ended up in the trash. On the 8th day, the doorbell didn't ring. Instead, a gold embossed contract was delivered to his studio. Thompson Corporation Annual Partnership Proposal was written across the top in bold letters, with terms that would make any new designer swoon. Caleb glanced at it once, then closed the folder. "Send it back." His assistant hesitated. "The budget, Ms. Thompson is offering is extremely generous. Sir, perhaps you should reconsider." Caleb picked up a pair of scissors and, without looking up, said coldly, "Tell Ms. Thompson that some things, once cut, can't be sewn back together. Besides, I have no interest in anything she's offering." Victoria stood before the returned contract in her office, her temples throbbing. "What did he say to you?" "He said," the assistant relayed, bracing herself, "that the two of you are completely over, and he suggests you focus your energy on your current partner." "Current partner?" Victoria smashed her teacup on the floor. "I locked Julian up weeks ago," but the words died in her throat. She suddenly realized that in Caleb's mind, she and Julian were still a single entity. Just like in the past, during her 20-day-a-month business trips, had he stood alone in the kitchen just like this, staring at a cold dinner? Her phone buzzed. It was a picture from Chloe's teacher. In her latest drawing of their family, Chloe had scribbled out the figure of Mommy with a thick black crayon. In that moment, Victoria finally understood the true depth of her failure. As a wife and as a mother. Huddled in a dark, cheap apartment, Julian stared at the news report on his television. Rising star designer Caleb Thompson wins International Fashion Award on the screen. Caleb was radiant in a white suit, surrounded by flashing cameras. Beside him, Lena gently adjusted the ribbon on his trophy. "Bastard." He hurled his wine glass at the screen, shattering it. "Why? Why does that piece of trash get to have such a good life? Why?" He rampaged through the room, smashing everything he could find. "Caleb, I will ruin you." With trembling fingers, he opened a hidden folder of photos on his phone. He selected a candid shot of Caleb and Lena in the studio and, using editing software, crudely photoshopped their heads onto the naked bodies of 2 people in bed. "Let's see you explain this." He sneered, sending the fake photo to Victoria with a message. "The sainted husband you miss so much has been sleeping his way to the top." He then uploaded a copy directly to a gossip blog. As the sent notification popped up, he burst into maniacal laughter. The online rumor mill churned furiously, and the story briefly trended. But the victory was short-lived. Someone, somewhere, began pulling strings, and soon, Julian's own sordid history was rocketing to the top of the trending topics, completely eclipsing the poorly faked photo. Julian hid in his hotel room, his fingers shaking as he scrolled through his phone. The internet was flooded with his own scandals. Forensic proof that the photo was a fake, audio recordings of him verbally abusing Chloe, the security footage of him deliberately sabotaging Caleb's design. Every post came with irrefutable evidence. The comment sections were a bloodbath. This man is pure evil. He pretended to be this perfect gentleman, but behind the scenes he was abusing a child and framing his ex. He's as stupid as he is vicious. How did Ms. Thompson ever fall for this guy? But she regrets it now. Too late. Caleb has a successful career and a new love. Serve them right. How? How could this happen? He threw his phone against the wall, his carefully constructed facade crumbling as tears streaked through his makeup. He thought sending the fake photo to Victoria would push her over the edge, make her hate Caleb forever. He never imagined Lena would hire a top-tier legal team that would debunk the photo in less than 24 hours and issue a public legal notice. Worse, Victoria's assistant had given her the photos of Chloe's bruises and the audio recordings. The woman who had once catered to his every whim was now standing before him, her eyes simmering with a murderous rage. The heavy iron door of the basement was thrown open, releasing a wave of damp, musty air. Julian was shoved roughly inside, his knees cracking against the cold concrete. He looked up at Victoria, who stood silhouetted in the doorway, his voice trembling. "Victoria, please, let me explain." "Explain?" Victoria let out a cold laugh. She stepped forward, the heel of her shoe pressing down on the back of his hand, grinding it slowly. "Explain how you abused my daughter? Or explain how you framed Caleb, time and time again?" She threw a handful of photos in his face, close-ups of the bruises and scratches on Chloe's pale skin. Victoria's eyes were bloodshot as she grabbed him by the throat. "Talk. What did you think you were doing?" Julian choked, a strangled cry escaping his lips. "Do you have any idea how Caleb treated you?" Her voice was a low, demonic growl. "You pretended to have a stomach ache, and he stayed up all night to cook for you. You accidentally burned yourself, and he was the first one there with bandages. And how did you repay him? By scheming and hurting him at every turn." She released him, and he crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. Victoria stood over him, her face unreadable in the dim light, which terrified him even more. He scrambled forward and clung to her leg. "Victoria, I'm sorry. I'll never do it again." His screams echoed through the basement. He apologized over and over, but Victoria had no intention of letting him go. A second later, a searing pain shot through his scalp as a bodyguard grabbed him by the hair and dragged him toward a wooden frame. Chains rattled as he was hoisted up, his wrists shackled above his head. "Caleb was so kind, so good to you. Why did you have to destroy him?" Victoria watched coldly, then nodded to the bodyguard. The bodyguard pulled a glowing hot iron from a bucket of coals. It hissed as it pressed against Julian's collarbone. "Ag!" The smell of burning flesh filled the air. Julian thrashed wildly, the chains biting into his wrists. The bodyguard continued to press the hot iron to his skin, leaving a trail of blistering welts as he screamed in agony. "It wasn't me. He framed me." Julian was barely coherent, but he still wouldn't confess. "Is that so? Still not ready to admit it, are you?" Victoria picked up a bucket of salt water and slowly poured it over his fresh wounds. Julian's screams turned shrill and ragged. The security cameras saw everything. She then picked up a large syringe filled with the same solution. Julian's eyes widened in terror as he struggled against his bonds. "No, please no." "Ag." The needle plunged into his arm, and the salt water was forced into his veins. His body convulsed, and he began to choke, spitting up blood and saliva. He was chained, bloody, and broken, but Victoria wasn't finished. She toyed with a small, sharp knife, her eyes glinting. "I was wrong. I was wrong. Please," he begged, his voice a hoarse whisper. Victoria sneered, the tip of the knife tracing a thin, bloody line down his cheek. "You love to play sick, don't you?" she said, her smile utterly devoid of mercy. "Well, now you can convalesce in here for a good long while." She turned to leave, then paused at the door and gave one last order to the bodyguards. "Keep him here. As long as you don't kill him, you can do whatever you want." The iron door slammed shut, swallowing Julian's final, desperate screams. "Victoria, you'll pay for this. You'll get what you deserve." Victoria stood by the window of the mansion, a file in her hands. It was a report she'd commissioned on everything Caleb had done for their family over the past 5 years. Selling his inheritance to save her company. Staying up all night to care for her sick parents. preparing hangover remedies for her after every drunken night out. And her repayment? Indifference, neglect, and betrayal. While she was sneaking around with Julian, Caleb had shouldered everything alone. The thought was a physical pain, a knife twisting in her gut. She started up the stairs and saw her daughter standing in her doorway. "Mommy!" Chloe stood timidly in the doorway, clutching the small teddy bear Caleb had sewn for her years ago. "I miss Daddy. When are you going to bring him back?" Seeing the child's red-rimmed eyes, Victoria knelt and pulled her into a tight embrace, a lump forming in her throat. Mommy misses him too, but she knew, with a certainty that felt like death, that some mistakes could never be undone. Lena had successfully scrubbed the internet of all the slander against Caleb, and the matter with Julian was, for now, concluded. She bought 2 tickets to a concert, determined to help Caleb relax. On a warm summer night, at an outdoor music festival, neon lights and stars mingled in the sky. Caleb looked up at his favorite band on stage, the lead singer's raw voice cutting straight to his soul. He hummed along, tapping his fingers to the beat, a genuine ease in his expression for the first time in a long time. Lena stood beside him, her gaze fixed on him. As fireworks exploded overhead, she suddenly took his hand, her voice both gentle and firm. "Caleb, I don't want to be just your friend anymore." Caleb froze, turning to meet her eyes. Her normally smiling eyes were now filled with a profound seriousness. "Give me a chance to be something more. Please." A flood of memories washed over him. The loneliness of his deathbed in his past life, the heartbreak at the airport in this one, all the days and nights of being taken for granted. His first instinct was to pull his hand away, but he stopped when he saw her knuckles were white with tension. The night wind rustled his hair. He looked in her eyes and realized it was time to try living a different way. He gave a small nod. "I'm willing to try." Lena's eyes lit up, as if they had captured the light of all the fireworks at once. She gently pulled him into a hug and whispered in his ear, "I will show you what it feels like to be truly loved." 3 months later, the Caleb Thompson Design Studio officially opened. Standing before the bright, floor-to-ceiling windows, Caleb ran his hand over the new brass plaque on the door, a sense of disbelief washing over him. In his last life, he was trapped in Victoria's world for 50 years. In this one, he was finally standing on his own stage. "I've already made contact with our people in Milan," Lena said, wrapping her arms around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder. "But the final decision is yours. You can do whatever style you want." Caleb turned to look at her. "You're not afraid I'll screw it up?" "What's to be afraid of?" She smiled and kissed his fingertips. "Worst case, I'll sell my paintings to support you." Sunlight streamed through the sheer curtains. Caleb suddenly realized that, somewhere along the way, he had learned how to smile again, genuinely and without reservation. Meanwhile, in the CEO's office of the Thompson Corporation, a loud crash echoed through the room. "What did you say?" Victoria gripped the photos that had just been delivered, her knuckles turning white. The photos showed Caleb and Lena holding hands, smiling at each other at the studio's opening party. The assistant swallowed hard. "Mr. Thompson's studio opened today. Professor Jiang has apparently given him all of her overseas contacts." A glass slammed against the window, shattering on impact. Victoria's chest heaved, that old, familiar feeling of suffocation returning. This time, she knew she had been the one to push him into someone else's arms. "Mommy!" Chloe stood in the doorway, clutching a picture book, startled by the mess. Victoria forced herself to calm down. She reached for her daughter, but Chloe shied away. The little girl tilted her head. "Mommy, why are you sad?" "Auntie Lena says Daddy's smile is the best thing in the world, and she makes him smile every day." "Auntie Lena." Victoria's throat tightened. "She's good to him?" "Super good." Chloe counted on her fingers. She peels his shrimp for him. She remembers he doesn't like cilantro, and she sings his favorite song. The child paused. "Mommy, what's wrong?" Victoria touched her cheek and found it wet with tears. She quickly turned away. Those small, intimate details were like 1,000 tiny knives, gutting her from the inside out. After 5 years of marriage, she never knew Caleb was allergic to shellfish, hated the taste of cilantro, or what song he always had playing on repeat. Late that night, Victoria sat by her daughter's bed, listening to the little girl chatter excitedly about her father's new life. "Last week, Auntie Lena took us on a picnic, and Daddy baked the best cookies," Chloe said, rolling over with her teddy bear. "Mommy, why did you never want to go on picnics with us?" Victoria had no answer. She remembered Caleb once tentatively suggesting a family vacation, only for her to shut him down, claiming she was too busy. She found out later that he had spent 3 months planning the entire trip, right down to packing Chloe's allergy medication. Go to sleep, she whispered, gently patting her daughter's back, humming a lullaby she didn't recognize. Outside, the moonlight was pale and cold, just like her heart. After talking with Chloe, Victoria's past cruelty became even more apparent to her. She obsessively checked Caleb's social media, watching him become more successful, more charismatic, and the guilt was an ever-present weight in her chest. She wanted to explain that she had changed, that she had nothing to do with Julian anymore. She started waiting outside Caleb's apartment building every day, desperate for a chance to speak with him. Rain fell in sheets, blanketing the city in a damp gloom. Victoria stood outside Caleb's building, completely drenched. Her expensive suit was soaked through, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. She had been coming here for 7 days straight, waiting from dawn till dusk, just for a glimpse of him. She didn't know what she was hoping for, only that she couldn't imagine a life without him. Caleb. She rasped, her voice raw. She saw the familiar figure emerge from the building and rush toward him. I'm sorry, Caleb. I was wrong. Please come back. Caleb, holding a black umbrella, walked right past her without breaking stride. Rainwater dripped from the edge of the umbrella, splashing at her feet. He didn't even look at her. Ms. Thompson, he said calmly, we have nothing to do with each other anymore. Victoria reached for him but grabbed only cold, empty air. Watching his resolute back disappear down the street, her heart felt like it was being torn apart. The next day, Victoria sold the mansion they had shared and moved into a high-rise apartment directly across from his. Every morning, the first thing she did was stand by her window and watch Lena meet Caleb downstairs. She watched them walk away together, laughing as Lena saw him off to work. Every evening, she watched them return, carrying bags of fresh groceries, sometimes a bouquet of flowers. She was a pathetic voyeur, using binoculars to watch the lights in their apartment, to see Caleb moving around in the kitchen, to see Lena curled up on the sofa, reading his design sketches, occasionally leaning over to press a kiss to his cheek. All the tenderness that had once been hers was now someone else's. At night, Victoria sat alone in her empty living room, flipping through old photo albums. In every picture, Caleb was standing quietly in the background, a gentle smile on his face, while her own gaze was always directed elsewhere. She realized with a jolt that she couldn't remember his favorite food, his favorite color, or even his birthday. She traced the smile on the man in the photo, as if trying to burn it into her memory. Caleb, I'm so sorry. A single tear fell as she clutched the photo and drifted into a restless sleep. In her desperation, Victoria stood outside Caleb's apartment all night. When he left for work in the morning, he walked by without a word. Caleb, if you don't talk to me, I'm not leaving. She waited stubbornly, but that night, a torrential downpour began. The next morning, a security guard found her unconscious by the flower beds, burning with a high fever. She was rushed to the hospital. In her hospital bed, she weakly opened her eyes. Her first words were, Did he come? Her assistant looked away. Mr. Thompson's assistant dropped this off. She handed over a small note. On it were 3 cold, impersonal words, Get well soon. Victoria stared at the note and started to laugh, a broken, hollow sound that made her eyes burn. He doesn't even hate me anymore. After the fever broke, Victoria stood on the hospital roof, looking toward Caleb's apartment. She thought of all the nights he had waited up for her, all the shirts he had ironed, all the soup he had made for her. And all she had given him in return was indifference, neglect, and betrayal. She took out her phone and called her lawyer. That asset transfer agreement we drew up, I'm adding another clause. Transfer all of my shares in the Thompson Corporation to Chloe's name, with Caleb as the sole trustee. After hanging up, she took one last look at the apartment building with its warm, glowing lights and walked away. Victoria stood outside Caleb's studio, a thick stack of documents clutched in her hand. Share transfer agreements, property deeds, bank drafts, even an inventory of her prized watch collection. Her entire net worth was in that folder. Her knuckles were white, her suit still damp from the rain. When Caleb pushed the door open to leave, she lunged at him as if he were a lifeline, shoving the documents into his hands. Her voice was a ragged mess. Caleb, I'm giving you everything. The company, the house, all my money. Everything I own is yours. Please, just come back to me. Caleb looked down at the check in his hand. The number on it was large enough to buy the entire building, but he just let out a soft laugh and, right in front of her, slowly tore the check in half. What I wanted was never any of this. The pieces of paper fluttered from his fingertips like pale, fragile snowflakes. Victoria's pupils constricted. She grabbed his wrist, her voice cracking with desperation. Then what do you want? I'll change anything. Her voice rose to a frantic, tearful plea. I love you, Caleb. Please come back. I wanted respect. I wanted trust. I wanted the 5 years you wouldn't even bother to look at me. Caleb pulled his hand free, his voice terrifyingly calm. You can't give me that, Victoria, he added, and even if you could, it's far too late. As he walked away, Victoria felt her insides twist into a painful knot. That night, in the VIP lounge of a golf club, Victoria threw a glass of whiskey in Lena's face. Leave him, she hissed, grabbing the collar of Lena's shirt, her eyes bloodshot. How much do you want? 50 million? 100 million? Do you want a partnership with my company? I can give you anything. Lena calmly rolled up her sleeves, then swung, her fist connecting squarely with Victoria's jaw and sending her sprawling onto a leather sofa. That was for Caleb, she said, pulling at her tie, a rare, dangerous glint in her eyes. You hurt him for years. What right do you have to ask for his forgiveness now? Victoria wiped the blood from her lip and sneered. You think you've won? Let me tell you, the years we spent together, the history we have. You can't compete with that. He's just confused right now. Real love isn't about possession. It's about respect. Lena cut her off, her gaze as sharp as a razor. And that's a lesson you will never learn. Victoria froze. She suddenly realized that this calm, composed woman became a wolf when it came to protecting Caleb. Victoria found herself drawn to Caleb's studio every day. She stood in the shadows of the hallway like a stalker, watching through the glass walls. Inside, Caleb and Lena were huddled over a design sketch. He'd point to a swatch of fabric, and she'd instantly produce the right color chart. He'd frown in thought, and she would have already replaced his coffee with his favorite jasmine tea. As he took the cup with a smile, his hair would brush her cheek, and the easy, unspoken understanding in their shared glance was a physical pain for Victoria to witness. She suddenly remembered all the handmade lunches she had thrown away, the research he'd stayed up all night compiling that she'd used as a coaster, the design ideas he'd tentatively proposed that she'd dismissed with a curt, "What would a stay-at-home dad know about it?" It wasn't that Caleb was boring. It was that she had never truly seen him. Ms. Thompson, the studio assistant's voice pulled her back to reality. Mr. Thompson asked that if you don't have any business here, you refrain from loitering outside the studio. A hammer blow to the chest. She had once been his entire world, and now she was a loiterer to be shooed away. Victoria, Caleb's voice came from behind her. She whirled around to see him standing there. The sun shone through his white shirt, outlining his slender frame. A simple, elegant ring glinted on his left hand. We're over, he said, his tone as mild as if he were discussing the weather. Let yourself go. His words were the final bullet, piercing the last bit of hope in her heart. She slowly sank to the floor and, for the first time in years, cried like a child. I'm sorry. Caleb, I'm so sorry. Caleb watched her for a moment, then turned and walked back into his studio. Just before the door closed, he heard her choked, desperate cry from the floor. But I really do love you now. His hand paused on the doorknob for a fraction of a second, but he didn't look back. The timing had always been wrong for them. It was too late. Lena started planning the proposal a week in advance. She secretly contacted Caleb's favorite planetarium and arranged to borrow their professional star projection equipment. On the day, she sent all the studio employees home early and transformed the fitting room, where Caleb spent most of his time, into a miniature universe. Can you come to the fitting room for a minute? She texted him while he was in a meeting. When Caleb pushed open the door, the room was plunged into darkness. The Milky Way flowed at his feet, and the stars of Orion twinkled on the surrounding walls. Lena stood in the center of the starlight, projections of all his design work from the past few years swirling around her. What is? Caleb covered his mouth in astonishment. Lena knelt on one knee and pulled a small velvet box from her pocket. As she opened it, all the projected starlight in the room seemed to converge on the ring inside, the diamond glowing with a soft blue light. You once told me that diamonds symbolize a new beginning. Lena's voice trembled slightly. The design of this ring was inspired by your award-winning piece. Tears sprang to Caleb's eyes. He recognized it. It was a detail he had sketched for his collection, one that the critics had told him to remove. I secretly contacted a jeweler in Italy. It took 3 months to get it right. Lena said, gently taking his hand. Just like every day we've been together, you've shown me a more beautiful world. Caleb, will you marry me? Before she even finished, Caleb threw his arms around her, his tears soaking the shoulder of her dress. He nodded, choking back sobs, his fingers clutching her clothes, as if he were afraid it was all a dream. Lena carefully slid the ring onto his finger, then produced another, simpler band from her pocket. Now it's your turn. On their wedding day, the small chapel was filled with Caleb's favorite flowers. Lena had hired the best string quartet in the city to play the pieces he had once written about in an old journal, describing his dream wedding. Chloe, in a custom-made dress, was a bundle of nerves. She held Caleb's hand tightly and whispered, "Daddy, I practiced for a whole month. I promise I won't step on Annie Lena's dress." When the wedding march began, Caleb walked his daughter down the aisle. His suit had been designed by Lena, the cuffs embroidered with a subtle star pattern that matched the galactic theme of his ring. When they reached the altar, Chloe pulled out a small piece of paper and read from it seriously. "On behalf of my mom, I give my daddy to Annie Lena." She paused, then added, "Mommy said you have to make him happy this time." Caleb's tears fell instantly. Lena knelt to be at eye level with Chloe. "I promise you I will." They exchanged vows, kissing in front of all their friends and family, each saying "I do" with a full and certain heart. At the reception, Victoria sat alone at a table in the far corner. She hadn't touched her wine. A sharp pain in her stomach made her break out in a cold sweat. When the newlyweds had their first dance, she watched Lena lead Caleb across the floor, her movements as gentle as if she were handling something priceless. The image brought back the memory of their own wedding night, when she had gone to bed without even looking at him. "Ma'am, would you care for some cake?" a server asked, pulling her from her thoughts. She shook her head, then saw Caleb walking toward her. "Thank you for coming," he said, stopping in front of her table. Victoria tried to speak, but was seized by a violent coughing fit. She pressed a handkerchief to her mouth, but a smear of blood seeped through. Caleb's expression changed instantly. He instinctively started to reach for her, but Lena was suddenly there, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "Do you need a doctor?" Lena asked, her voice full of genuine concern. Victoria shook her head and managed to get to her feet. "Congratulations." As she walked away, she heard Caleb quietly say, "Take care of yourself." Those words were sharper than any knife, severing her last, desperate hope. In the parking lot, she collapsed over the steering wheel and finally allowed herself to sob. In the rearview mirror, the warm, colored lights of the chapel windows still glowed, a world she could never enter again. 3 years after the wedding, Caleb Thompson Designs had become one of the country's top couture brands. The couple ran the studio together, their life happy and fulfilling. Morning sunlight streamed into their apartment. Caleb stood in their walk-in closet, his fingers brushing over rows of suits and shirts arranged by color. Lena had designed them all for him, each one tagged with the occasion and date. Meeting with the French clients today, Lena wrapped her arms around him from behind, holding out 2 sets of cufflinks for him to choose from. This kind of meticulous care was something he had once given to others. Now, finally, someone was giving it to him. Outside the Thompson Corporation headquarters, foreclosure notices slapped against the glass doors in the wind. After years of mismanagement, the company had finally declared bankruptcy. Watching the business empire she had been so proud of crumble, Victoria had nothing to say. She crouched on the sidewalk across the street, smoking, the hem of her once expensive dress now frayed. The pain from her late-stage stomach cancer forced her to hunch over, but she never lit the cigarette. The doctor had said her lungs couldn't take it. Her phone lit up with a final notification from the bank. "All assets under your name have been frozen." She looked up at the massive billboard on the luxury department store across the street. It was an ad for Caleb's brand. He was wearing one of his own designs, looking radiant beneath the glowing Caleb Thompson logo. Once this man had been her husband, ironing her dresses and making her soup. Now, he was a star, and she was no longer in his orbit. She deserved this, even if she was drowning in regret. This was the consequence she had to accept. Meanwhile, in a cheap rental in a run-down part of the city, Julian grinned madly at his reflection. The mirror was plastered with magazine clippings of Caleb accepting awards. "That bastard," he hissed, then smashed the mirror with his fist. His reputation was so toxic he could no longer find work in any industry. Just then, the doorbell rang. His landlord was standing there with 2 police officers. "Mr. Vance, we need you to come with us to answer some questions regarding allegations of defamation." He tried to slam the door, but they blocked it. He backed away, frantic. "Stay away from me." The TV in the background was playing a fashion news segment. Founder of Caleb Thompson Designs, Mr. Thompson has just announced the creation of a new foundation to assist and mentor struggling female designers. Julian suddenly burst out laughing, a wild, unhinged sound that slowly dissolved into sobs. He finally understood. Some consequences, though they take their time, are unavoidable. The setting sun painted the sea in shades of crimson over the Maldives. Caleb leaned his head on Lena's shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, gently running her fingers through his hair. The wedding band on her finger glowed in the twilight. Caleb gazed at the horizon. He saw an image of his past self, dying alone in a hospital bed. He remembered the family portrait at the airport when he was reborn, the trembling of his hand as he signed the divorce papers. In this life, he had finally lived for himself. Nothing. He turned and hugged his wife, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Lena kissed his cheek. "You deserve all the good things in the world." When they returned home, an anonymous package was waiting at the studio. Inside was a rare, out-of-print collection of design books and a beautifully bound photo album. The first page was a photo of him at 20. The following pages were filled with clippings of every public appearance he had made over the past few years, accepting awards, giving interviews, even candid street-style shots. Each one was carefully dated, some with small, handwritten notes. "This haircut suits him," or "He looks a little tired here." The last few pages were blank, except for a single sticky note on the final page. "The rest is for you and her to fill. I'm sorry I failed you." There was no signature, but they both knew who it was from. Lena wrapped her arms around him from behind. "Should we contact her?" Caleb gently shook his head and placed the album on the highest shelf of his bookcase. "Some stories," he said, "are best left with their endings." Lena looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep, endless tenderness.